everyone. Welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a graduate student in education, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Death is something everyone will experience, and the thought of death can be the greatest fear for some people and the most intriguing mystery for others. Today we'll look at all the different ways cultures around the world have conceptualized the deities of death in the first part of the show, while examining philosophical paradigms of the afterlife in the latter part. Okay, so, last week we had an interesting conversation on aging, and, we talked about kind of inserting episodes here and there about different, in our little series of gods and mythological deities and things. So I thought, okay, well, aging kind of naturally leads into death, and death has a pretty wide range of deities, in ancient and modern culture. And then after that, we can kind of talk about the afterlife some, because as much as that is a cool concept to me, I didn't, and we probably could have, but wasn't sure if we could fill up a whole show with it. So one thing I do think we might be able to fill up a whole show with that we might want to do after this one would be the soul, or like the concept of.
Oh my, yes, that's
yeah. So we'll see where we go, how far we get, but. So yeah, we'll start with the gods of death, and we're going to stick with the cultures that we've done with the other shows. Mm-hmm. So let's look at the Greek god of death first, Thanatos.
Okay, and this is really interesting to start with, because I'm sure you're aware that it's probably the most recognizable in some ways to current pop culture. Thanatos sounds very close to something you may have heard in movies.
Yeah.
Right. And so Thanos, the Marvel character that Jim Starlin created in the 70s, was a direct derivation of Thanatos, a lot of characteristics therein. And so that's a really good familiar place to begin with, because it's familiar, but then it sort of messes around with it. So we have these gods of death. The Greek structure is filled with all kinds of this is an organizational chart. Who punishes and which beings punish and how much they punish and where they go and who's in charge of conveying this and that. And it's just fascinatingly complicated. We could have done a whole thing on just that one, and we won't. So Thanatos is the son of Nyx, which is night, and the brother of Hypnos, who is sleep. And Thanatos is essentially not mentioned. It was mentioned by Euripides in his plays. It's not mentioned nearly as much as some of the others, but is really a conveyor. So Euripides actually painted him visually as this slender, black, cloaked creature with a sword. But that's not how the mythological system really had it earlier. He was a winged spirit who comes with the wings and sort of smothers you, or just picks you up and says it's your time and goes. Conveys you to the edge of Hades, and then you do the rest of the trip.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that you mentioned Thanos at the beginning, because if you've seen the movies, I feel like that he does do a pretty good job of kind of conveying the character, because if you just read the description, it might be kind of hard to imagine, because, you get some things where, okay, well, he's merciless.
Yeah.
And he's kind of tireless. He's going to pursue a quarry. But at the same time, he's generally shown as being a peaceful god. There's an entirely other god, Kairos?
Yes.
That is responsible for violent death.
Yes.
So those two kind of things are sort of hard to reconcile if you're just reading words on a page and thinking about it abstractly. Well, he's merciless and tireless, but he's also kind of a peaceful, oh, wait, hold on.
Yeah, and you see that in now this is in no way, gotta be careful with this because people take things so seriously, but Thanos is a supervillain in the films, but nonetheless, he is a fascinating character because he claims to want to fulfill his role in the universe and to, without distinction, eliminate beings so that the universe can continue to thrive. So there's that element of having a responsibility. There's that element of being the conveyor. But at the same time, I'm just doing this because nobody else can do it. And it needs to be done. And so, yeah.
And you definitely get the, the distinct impression with Thanos. He is the villain. So there's a the element of disingenuous or maybe just kind of psychotic intent behind, and he's definitely violent.
Yes.
But if you were to separate that, if you say, okay, if you had Thanos as a character, but he was not meant to be good or evil, he just fulfilled a role of bringing death.
Yeah.
You could see, okay, well, that kind of makes sense. He is kind of more, he's sort of peaceful. He's calm. He's just, like you said, he's just trying to do what he's supposed to do, so that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the other interesting part that I saw when I was looking him up was, like you said, the whole family tree. And that definitely has important philosophical implications, right? For a culture, like how does the culture fit death into its thinking? And I think that you look at his siblings and you definitely get a pretty clear idea of what the Greeks thought about it.
And the Greeks were very methodical. And so everything has this place. And of course, if any culture, the Greeks would be the ones that have this, as I say, organizational chart of, here, then you go there. And then not just an organizational chart, but a flow chart. Well, if you've done this, then here's where you're going to go. And this is what's going to happen. And and not all cultures are like that.
Yeah, so it's a pretty interesting one, especially, like I said, if you put him in the context of his siblings.
Yeah.
I encourage people to look that up because you can see that, the Greeks, there's a lot of negative connotations with death, I think, in their culture, just based off of, okay, they had the sibling, the aging and, darkness and these other things that, are kind of...
Well, there's a whole group of creatures called the Erinyes, and the Erinyes... primarily their function, they're called the dogs of Hades. They're not Cerberus, but they're sometimes visualized not solely as canines, of course, but their focus is parricides, people who've killed their fathers, and people who've broken their oaths. So we've got those two. These characters are going after. It gets really complicated,
right? Yeah, that's a lot different from Western Christianity, where you have God and the devil, and you have demons and angels, but really that's like the extent of the differentiation. There's not these like specific beings who have specific sort of roles that they fulfill in the whole system like that. All right, so let's look at hell in Norse mythology. So as much like Thanos or Thanatos, hell probably sounds pretty familiar to a lot of people.
Yep. So hell, Hel, who one must say also appears as an iteration in Marvel Comics and it's not an advertisement. It's just that's probably the most immediately accessible. In Ragnarok, the last Thor movie that we've seen before all the pandemic, then Hel shows up. Hel is the daughter of Loki, the trickster. Hel is represented very gruesomely, sort of a two-faced. Half of Hel is rotting and dead and dark, and the other half is still somewhat alive. And is the owner and operator of Hel.
Yeah. So there's a lot of interesting things there, right? So First off, Hel's the daughter of Loki, and Loki is sort of the god of mischief, right?
Yeah.
What does that say about Norse feelings on death? Do you think that maybe the Norse just aren't as organizational as Greeks? Maybe it's just sort of an afterthought that they did this, or do you think there's a defined purpose behind that?
There's a defined purpose behind this, I think, and I'm too simplistic as always, but there are three fields or places where one goes in the one can go in the afterlife in Norse mythology. I'm really simplistically because it's different for Scandinavian and Norwegian, but Hell, her zone is for those who die of natural causes, of old age or disease. And typically because of it's organizational, but it's less structured than the Greeks in the sense of you've got these three possibilities. If you die of natural causes or disease, then you are going to go to hell's realm. If you die as a warrior, fighting death, sort of Klingon kind of stuff, then you go to one of two places. And so you either go with Odin to Valhalla, or you go with the Queen of the Valkyries and to Folkvanger, it's called, which is, so Odin and the Queen of the Valkyries divide up half and half. And there's a whole story that goes with that. But essentially, from the studies that have been done of this, it looks like if you were upper crust leader, a commander, you go with Odin. If you were the grunt on the ground, you go to Folkvanger. And you're still celebrated as a hero, and you still get wined and dined and go out and battle and kill yourself and then come back again the next day. And so there are three zones, and hell is the one where it's the least honorable in the sense of having, well, you just shriveled away and died, and that's not something the Norse really appreciated.
Right.
So to me, that makes sense that the daughter of the trickster and a giant, who's half and half, who's partly living, partly rotting, it's sort of an ugly image and a very brutal character. And, so if you're lucky enough to live to an old age, too bad for you.
Yeah. And so, the image probably says something as well, right? Now, when these people died of old age, did hell kind of fulfill the role that some of these other gods do, where did she transport people to death, or was there no such deity there? Was she just the goddess of the underworld?
In that system, the Valkyries transport the warriors. Hell has assistants. The names are eluding me at the moment, but who mostly do the transporting.
Yeah, the reason I asked is because her image seems to suggest a transition from life to death.
Yes.
So I didn't know if that was something that played into the mythology at all. And yeah, so she has siblings as well that are not humanoid characters, right?
Yeah.
And so she has these two siblings, and one's the snake, right?
Yes. Loki did not do good offspring. And the other's Fenris Wolf.
Right.
This monstrous wolf, whose unleashing is part of the end of all things. But that's really indicative of various aspects of Loki's character. The snake is pretty, what we associate with snakes, and the wolf, which is his utter capacity to be brutal. At the same time, the wolf is Fenris is probably more. Not empathic, that's not the word. We might have more sympathy for Fenris. I do sometimes in the stories when I think about it, really, because Loki is put in the position of having to chain up his son. So actually, Loki is sacrificing his son for the balancing of the whole system and how it's supposed to go. With the snake, too, but not I think as directly. So, yeah.
Yeah, so the interesting thing there, right, is so you have the wolf and the snake. Neither one is humanoid. And then they serve a specific kind of role. But then there's Hel, and she's humanoid for the most part. She's actually put in charge of a section of the underworld.
Right.
So there's a lot of differentiation between her and then her siblings.
Right, and then remember there's Freya.
Yeah.
Who, this gets really messy because she wasn't Frigg or Frigga the wife of Odin in much of the Norse mythology, but then, as things do, it became conflated, and so she's sometimes associated as wife of Odin and not. But she was the first Valkyrie, the supreme leader of the Valkyries, basically, and that's why Folkvanger is her place to take the folk, the ordinary warriors. But she's a really interesting character too, as is Hel, but I think even perhaps more so because there's an acknowledgement in whereas to me the Greeks parcel out this characteristic or that aspect to a particular person, being, and we talked about this I think some the other talk. And the Norse sort of acknowledges the duality of characters. So Freya is the protector of marriage and fertility. And many death gods are, interestingly. But she is not at all opposed to sleeping around. but she guards others' marriages.
Right.
So she with a vengeance. But for her, those rules don't apply to me. So it's not all pretty, but and it's not simplistic. And she tricks Odin sometimes, and he tricks her sometimes, when it's the iteration of husband and wife. But even before it became conflated, she was quite capable of doing complicated things.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Those Norse characters are more complicated and multifaceted than.
And I think, therefore, more recognizable.
Yeah. All right, so that's... the one other thing I wanted to cover was the actual place of Hell, right? Because portions of Hell have names that kind of go along with...
There's Hames, H-E-I-M, the home of, or the field of.
Yeah. And so that's kind of like... whereas the Greeks created separate gods for things like aging and things like, the negative connotations that go along with
behavior.
Death.
Yeah.
In the Norse mythology, the actual place of Hell has names for things like the threshold is... The word for the threshold of Hell is like... translates to stumbling block and different, aging. And so their negative connotations actually take on the place of... things in the place of Hell.
Yes, it's not it's spatial in orientation, rather than characteristic in orientation. It's class rather than specifics. Yeah.
So it's as we going into it, we weren't sure. Okay, maybe how does this make sense? It looks like they were just as organized as the Greeks, but the way they conceptualized it was different.
Yeah.
All right, so let's look at the Hindu god of death, which is Yama.
Yep.
The thing that I found interesting about him is that he became the god of death merely by being the first person to die.
Yes. Now, do you remember when we talked about the Gilgamesh, and we were mentioning Gilgamesh?
Yeah.
And so Utnapishtim is the person who survives their version of the Ark. And therefore is sitting in a neutral zone, really well into the zone of immortality. He's immortal. But he has to talk to Gilgamesh about why it's ridiculous to seek immortality. You don't want this. This is not a gift. Well, I think that there's some aspect of that, curiously, in Yama, because just because you were the first human, so to speak, and then so you died, then you're put in charge of the afterlife. I mean, what you could ask, because he's raised so many questions. When there are lots of things about Yama, but what qualifies you to be president or whatever? Why? And then there's also that aspect of Yama and Yami, who is sort of the Adam and Eve characters in that system, but brother and sister, and so they're completely bonded. But he won't create children with her, and because nope, we're not doing this. So we got that ancient taboo there. But yeah, there he is.
Yeah. And so as far as he had kind of he's a pretty scary character to look at, right?
Oh yeah. He's variously represented as blue or green with forearms, sometimes swords, staff, anything that he can bash you with. He is not a pleasant person.
Mm-hmm.
But once you get in, then he's going to guard you.
Yeah, so it's a pretty, and again, with Hindu, we're getting into a pretty complicated system as well, because in Hinduism, in a lot of cases, people don't actually believe in the afterlife in any way, shape, or form. So in some places, it's kind of, okay, well, you just go from life into reincarnation. Then in other places, it's like, okay, well, there's sort of a purgatory kind of phase. And then in some other cases, you have, this kind of sort of an afterlife.
Yeah. And so, and in some of these systems, and with Yama, this is the case. You once you get in, then you drink. In this case, is a drink translated as soma. Well, if you think of the prefix or the root word soma, what words do we think of? Somnambulism and sleep studies and so on. Well, soma is the drink that makes you immortal. So you're not immortal yet, even though you've gone to their version of the underworld. You have this drink to have immortality, and Yama looks after you once you're there. So there may be this violent end. There's this, which I think is metaphorically, if not literally, suggestive of the difficulty of passage for some. And I think that it's honorable that they do that in that story kind of way. That, this is not pleasant.
Yeah.
The pleasant part comes afterward. But I don't know any yet any stories where this happens in that version of the underworld, or that happens in that version of the underworld. Once you're there, it's just sort of you're there.
Yeah, so you probably can't answer this for me, because I'm realizing now that I didn't actually give you any kind of notes or references going into this episode what we were going to talk about.
But that's okay. I brought my you hear these pages flipping, because in my studies of mythology over the years, I keep going back to as a basic source the Larousse Encyclopedia of Mythology. It's a classic source. It's dated in some ways, but it's so much more academic than some of the websites one finds, but they're helpful to start the conversation.
Right. So kudos to Norm for just on the fly, off the cuff, figuring out what characters we're talking about and what we're doing. But so you might not be able to answer this, but I'm just sort of curious, so you die and then you're not immortal until you drink the soma. What happens if you were to say die again in the afterlife before drinking the somas? Is there?
Well, theoretically, that's built into the possibility of the story. There's one story. I won't attempt to pronounce the names because I haven't practiced them, but off the top of one's head, there's a sort of a reversal of some of the Greek stories. A husband dies, a woman goes down to get him. She has to make a deal with Yama in order to get him. He doesn't want to make that deal, but he makes the deal because the husband hasn't had the soma yet. And so the short form is she tricks him. He's not happy about it, but the husband gets to go back.
Okay. All right, yeah, I was just curious about.
So maybe you hold off and say, nope, don't want my soma yet. Let's just wait in case somebody comes to get me. But there's not a precedent for that. That doesn't happen in lots of stories. That's one story.
Yeah. So, and there are some stories that, when you're looking up Thanatos or some of these other ones, you do see that happen occasionally, where they say, listen, these guys are relentless. Like they're gonna they're going to take you.
Yeah.
But then there's always a couple stories where they get tricked by somebody. And
what do you think that says?
I'm not sure because, I'm thinking back to, I was at church a couple of weeks ago and the pastor said, well, what happened to everybody that Jesus healed? He raised Lazarus from the death. What happened to Lazarus?
I love that question.
He still dies, right? At some point, we're assuming.
Yes.
We don't see a 2,000-year-old guy walking around out there, right? So
no, that's Methuselah, but that's before.
Yeah, so he dies. So we're assuming that these people that tricked these gods of the afterlife and brought back their loved ones, at some point, they die anyways, right?
Yeah. And so this is a question. And again, I have to always say this because I don't want people reading this the wrong way. I take all stories, including the Christian stories, fascinating representations of how we are as people and what we say about ourselves. But to me, that's one of the most problematic New Testament stories because, and marvelous in its own way, because here's the Son of God who finds out that his dear friend has died. We haven't heard about this dear friend in any of the other stories. Suddenly he's got a best friend. It's not one of the disciples. He gets there. His friend has died. He brings him back. Well, that's an act of friendship. That's to me. There is a little umbilical to the Gilgamesh story again. It's not the same story, but you're so not wanting that person to have died that you bring him back knowing that he's going to die again. Now, maybe that's to get his affairs in order, to have a life and to really think about what death means and who knows? I mean, there are all kinds of possibilities. Sort of theologians deal with this on a daily basis, but it's just interesting because the prioritization just changes.
Yeah. And so some of these ancient mythological stories are a little bit different because in the Greek or in the Hindu versions here, it's usually, like you said, it's a husband or a wife going into the underworld to get back a loved one. So what do you think those stories are saying?
Well, I think they're a measure of the indomitable optimism that one has about one's own mortality, that I can, if I believe hard enough and want hard enough to bring that person back, I can have them if I'm smart enough for a while. But nobody thinks about that for a while because then it's still going to happen.
Right.
So it has to be maybe a combination of fear and optimism. No, not now. This is not the right time. I refuse.
Yeah.
And so there's that sense that human beings can overcome death itself, one way or the other, which does have a huge implication in Christian teaching, but in all these other systems, there's those elements that I can beat this if I'm smart enough and I love enough, but not everybody, just one or two people.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's interesting, because it makes me wonder where those kind of stories came from, right? Because mythology as a whole, when we've been looking through them, there's a lot of weird things and a lot of different stuff, but all of it seems to have some kind of, sort of metaphorical or basis to it. Mm-hmm. This one seems like one where it would be like, nope, when you're dead, you're dead. But they always leave that door open in the one or two stories where somebody comes back.
They do, and they're different permutations. In the Greek, it's don't look back. You have to have the belief that you've gone down, you've gotten your person, she's behind you. But if you look back over your shoulder, that's it. You lost them. So there's that really moralistic, never look back, always look forward, which is what Lot's wife turns into being, right? Don't look back. Don't. You look back, we punish you. So I think that's not exactly the same thing as tricking death. And maybe there's a basis for it in maybe there are a few extraordinary instances in the ancient worlds where someone was thought to have died but emerges from a coma.
That's what I'm thinking is because even, you know, if you think of somebody about to die, who's most likely to save them? Probably their husband or wife. So if somebody's drowning, right?
Yeah.
And a husband or wife sees them drowning, pulls them out of the water, they can appear to be dead, but maybe the husband or wife happens to accidentally resuscitate them. They think, oh, well, you brought them back from the dead, or, you know, saving them from a fire, or like you said, coming out of a coma, those things. The person most likely to save somebody or be there when they wake up or do those sorts of things is going to be that significant other. So maybe that does kind of play into the story some.
And I think it also brings up that at the same time brings up the tragic element of the reminder that it doesn't usually happen that way. And I'm treading really lightly with this one because an old friend, in many states away from us, his brother's wife died this past spring going through the ice to rescue one of her dogs in a pond on a college campus that she had attended, that her children attended, and the husband and the family saw it and couldn't do anything about it, and tried but couldn't do anything about it. And so I think it's bitter, sweet, it's difficult, it's tragic, and it's very a sharp, difficult story when you start digging into it, because for almost everybody that doesn't happen.
Right.
So why should that happen for you? What, you know, and so it could very easily be turned into oh, well, we have the ability, you know, we were stronger than you. All that kind of darkness and wrongness, I think the stories could stir up. But you know, I think staying more focused on it is just, we have this, we think we can do anything if we really put our minds to it.
Yeah, so that's just kind of an interesting thing to look into.
Yeah.
All right, let's look at Anubis, the Egyptian god of death. And in Egyptian mythology is extremely old. And again, much like the Hindu mythology, it gets kind of conflated at times and mixed up. So Osiris is seen as being the god of death. Isis, who we talked about in the past, has a large role. But Anubis is also kind of looked at as...
He's a conveyor.
Yeah, he's a conveyor.
You know, so again, he's not the governor of the zone. He's one of the conveyors. Anubis is particularly interesting to me for a couple of specific reasons, because essentially Anubis, when Osiris is destroyed by his jealous brother Set, Anubis is the one who creates funerary ritual. Anubis is the one who is attributed to whom is attributed mummification and embalmment. And here's what we do with the dead. So, unlike some systems which don't really target a single being that says, well, here's why we do our rituals that we do, this one does.
Yeah, and for that reason, I think that he's one of the most interesting and unique characters that we look at, because everybody is, you know, very familiar with Egyptian mummification or the Book of the Dead and all the rituals you have to go through and stuff. And all that kind of gets traced back to Anubis here, where, you know, that the things related to death that set Egyptian culture apart from some of these other cultures can pretty much be related to him. And that's kind of neat.
Yeah. And then there's Osiris. And it's, I don't know if you're going to Osiris, but we can talk about it. We might as well, since who is essentially, Osiris is lauded for having brought civilization to the rest of the world, meaning agriculture and various social principles. But his brother is jealous. When he comes back from saving the world, his brother threshes him like unto grain itself, which is what Osiris becomes the metaphor for, the vegetative god. And so he's shredded, sliced, diced, and Isis, his wife, wants him back, and they have to appeal to a panel of judges, one of whom is Anubis, one of whom is Horus, Horus, and one of whom is, I should remember, I'm looking at my notes, it'll come to me. Anyway, Thoth, I believe. And so and they listen to Isis's case and say, yeah, he gets to come back. So they bring him back, but he has a choice. They bring him back. They assume he's just going to live an immortal life governing humans. He said, nope, I'm going away. I'm going to go govern the underworld. And so, so what he does is he goes to what we call the Elysian Fields. He welcomes the souls. And the souls he welcomes are all the people who are just. Mm-hmm. So it's just come to this nice place that I have. It's quiet. I don't want anything part of the world in where you come down here. We'll take.
Yeah, and so Anubis plays an interesting role there because Egyptian conception of the afterlife is a little bit different from other ones. It's not like there's just a place you go, or there's one or two places where you go, and there's a good place and a bad place, this sort of thing. No, in Egyptian culture, Anubis, you have spells that you have to know. There's things you have to, you have to solve a whole bunch of puzzles, in order to get to the afterlife. And then when you get there, Anubis is the weigher of hearts, right?
Yes.
So you get through all of this, and then he's the one who gets to weigh your heart and determine, essentially weigh your soul. Mm-hmm. And if your soul is heavier than a feather. You get eaten. You get eaten, and there is no more afterlife. You're done. You just cease to exist. Right. If your soul is lighter than the feather, then you get to go on. So Egyptian afterlife is weird like that. I think in the ones we've looked at so far, there's always, it seems that there's always an afterlife for everybody. Mm-hmm. And in some cases it's neutral, in some places it's a good or bad place, or it's a class-based place. In Egyptian mythology, there's only an afterlife for some people, and that's kind of what makes it unique.
Yeah.
So yeah, man, it's each one of these cultures has their own kind of unique twist on things, and it makes it really interesting to look at.
It does.
Before we head into the, looking at different thoughts on the afterlife, the Japanese were our fifth culture that we had been looking at throughout our episodes on Gods of the Dead. Now, in Japanese, a lot of Japanese culture, religious beings kind of overlap with some Hindu ones. Yep. Or in some cases, Izanami, who we've already talked about, is seen as the god of death. So I thought that the one thing that we could look at that was sort of unique, and we don't have to spend a whole lot of time on it, but just to mention would be the Shinigami.
Which is not one.
Right. It's a whole host of different creatures. A lot of times it's talked about as they're different demons who kind of invite people to death.
Yeah.
Right? So that's kind of their unique contribution. It's a pretty dark concept. I mean, sometimes they're portrayed as helpers, but in a lot of cases they're monsters or demons or that sort of thing.
They're also called soul rippers.
Yeah. Yes. So and they have a large a lot of the main sort of aspect of their story is suicide, right?
Yes. Yeah. Which is of course in Japanese culture, there's honorable and dishonorable.
Yeah.
So I don't know that I don't know that it's helpful from my viewpoint to go into the different shades of that, except to say that not every culture necessarily deals with that topic.
Right.
The Japanese culture does, and it's worth knowing that. But I think the very ambiguity of Shinigami is their collectiveness in one. It's a collective, sometimes operating with one purpose, sometimes operating in vastly different ways all at the same time. So it's a really complicated notion, unlike having one being set up for this. Well, the Greeks again, or in the Norse, one being for a whole group of kinds of people. This is one set of beings who will go out, and pretty much it's not going to be a pleasant experience for anybody, but maybe different degrees of unpleasantness.
Yeah, so it's almost, the Japanese have a kind of a more individualistic view of that, I
Yeah.
suppose I'd say, because the Greeks have one deity that kind of looks over different types of things, and the Norse have one place or one thing that deals with a group of people. It sounds like the Japanese, the Shiganami, or are if you are approached by one, that thing that is dealing with you is sort of individual to you as opposed to somebody else who might be dealing. If you and somebody else both commit suicide or die in the same way, it might still be a different Shinigami that you were dealing with, a different issue.
Yes, and there's something that we have to we should bring up about this too, because unlike everything else we've been talking about, this is a new concept comparatively, really new. I mean, it enters Japanese mythology or folklore in the 18th to 19th century. So we're talking about a concept that may be 250, 300, whatever years old.
Right.
That's
yeah.
like,
That's
so the basis of that. It's speculated, of course, that it's because of Christian influence. She, death, and kami, which are spirits, so death spirits. But that wasn't there. There were ghosts. There were all kinds of ghost stories in the ancient world, but there wasn't a set of beings attributed to.
Yeah. So like I said, that we probably don't need to go into it any farther than that. But I think that even that much is enough to probably make people out there think, oh, wow, that sounds kind of interesting, and want to do some research on their own.
Yeah. Which is really the purpose.
Yeah. I mean, we're not covering any of this stuff in the type of depth that you could if you want to. So that's the whole purpose of going over these different ones, is just to get people thinking, oh, wow, it's kind of neat, and then explore the stories on their own. All right, so let's look at paradigms of the afterlife, right? Let's start with probably the one most Western cultures are most familiar with, which is a place for good and evil, right? You have is for a heaven or a hell, and it's not just Christian cultures that have good and bad places, but why don't we talk about that a little bit? Now, in a lot of these places, is it based on? It's based on deeds. Good people versus bad people. What criteria do different cultures use to decide who are good and bad people?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and the core question, because that is indicative of the complex approach to humanity that any particular culture has. So let's go to the feather guy.
Right. Yeah.
So. When Anubis is measuring you may have done enormous ills. But if you did one thing that seemingly counterbalances all of those ills, then your soul might be just slightly up enough to not be taken and gobbled up. So it's not about a successive life of goodness, 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 always goodness. And I'm not sure that it really is in the Christian story either, which is also, it's because at some point there's a salvational aspect, which says if I've done horrible things in my life, I'm still going to do penance for that. And the Catholic system has limbo and time, but in which you're awaiting. But there's not a string of always good deeds necessary in every single system. And I think the degree to which a system accommodates that there are negative things that human beings do, but that can still sometimes be counterbalanced, is much more human than the idea of always having to do good, because if you don't, you trip that one time and...
Yeah, so Anubis is a little bit different because, like you said, the scales are a good example. You're doing the weighing, right?
Yeah.
So you're figuring out, well, were you mostly good or mostly bad? Everybody does bad stuff, but were you mostly good? Whereas in Christian theology, it's a substitution, right? Like, okay, everybody's bad. Because you're bad, you can't get to heaven. So Jesus was sent as a substitute. So now you're sort of swapping. So it's almost again like that cheating death sort of story, right?
In a sense, I think, and I'm sure people close to you say no, but really there is. Yes, I think you're right. There's that aspect. Now it's not a game, and if you just say, "Oh, I'm saved," in the Christian system, that's not going to do it. There has to be some kind of. This is where philosophically the language which becomes action, the word act, which actually becomes the speech act, which actually becomes an act itself, which 20th century philosophers, language philosophers were talking about. That's, I think, what as an example, the Christian system is about. How nobody knows if your soul is saved. You can't see the soul. You can't say, all you can do is profess quietly or loudly and then live the principles as best you can, but you're still going to trip.
Right. And that leads to some sort of what appears to be conflicting things where it'll say like, well, yeah, good deeds don't get you into heaven, but at the same time, well, if you actually believe, then you'll do good deeds, right?
Yeah,
so it's sort of, like you were saying, it's more of an...
It's a visualization process. It's what so many coaches over the years have visualized hitting that basket.
You're changing from the inside out.
Yeah.
So doing these outside things doesn't mean the inside changed, but if the inside is changed, you will do these things on the outside, sort of. What other kind of... Are there other religions that have a heaven and a hell or a good and a bad place outside of Christianity that you can think of off the top of your head?
I'm thinking Chinese, mythology, Chinese. So we're talking about not Buddhism in a pure sense. So I'm thinking about the death conveyor in the opposite direction, Meng Po, Lady Meng, who is this figure who has a house just inside the exit from the underworld. And you have to drink a broth that she concocts as your soul is leaving. So once you've gone through punishment, and there the system is really interesting because you're punished if your soul is shredded. Immediately upon that punishment, it's put back together again. So you can go through it all over again. So it has that element of some Old Testament visions of hell. But once you've done your penance, then you go to Lady Meng on it's like the exit interview. you drink this broth and you forget everything. You forget that you were in hell. You forget what the punishments were. You forget who you were. And then you exit and you are put on the wheel of transmigration. It's just a gigantic structure, multicolored lights. So picture the Aurora Borealis and the biggest carousel you've ever seen. And you are put on that and immediately flung. And there are one of 6 places that you can either become a god if you've really reached that stage. You can become a human. You can become an animal, which is not so cool. There's much to learn. Or then you can become a demon, all the way down to you're right back where you were before because you hadn't learned anything. But you won't remember that. So the reason I bring that up is that when you're asking that, I think that's probably the most, not the most, but one of the more unusual counters to what we take as the more familiar.
Yeah, so in that one, that one's less polarized. It's less about there's a good place and a bad place, and there's more differentiation. Okay, well, there's a spectrum, right? You can, all right, we can end up all the way up here, or you can end up all the way down here.
It's not static. I mean, and in some ways, there's so many systems are. If you go to hell, you're in hell. You're in hell forever, and there it is. Pretty much, that's what Christianity teaches. Mm-hmm. So think about it, and we've talked about prison systems before. Think about it from the viewpoint of you're going in, you're never coming out. It doesn't matter. You're just going to be punished. As opposed to you're going in, it's going to be rough. You're going to be punished, but then you're going to be able to forget that, and you're going to give a chance to go back, and maybe this time you'll do better. But you don't get to go back knowing what you did before. You're going back with a fresh slate, so to speak.
And that's the weird part about it, right? Is that you think the moral of the story is to kind of learn from your mistakes and become a better person, but your whole memory is wiped, right? So it's like...
So if you learn from your mistakes, it has to be something that has nothing to do with memory.
Yeah.
It's really complicated.
That's pretty wild. All right, let's go in the opposite direction, which is a non-binary afterlife. So tell us about some religions where... Is there any of them, actually, where everybody goes to the same place?
In Hindu, the ultimate goal of what? Nirvana, the place where you don't have to transmigrate anymore. That's probably closest to it that I'm aware of.
So everybody's trying to end up there.
Yeah.
And can you explain what Nirvana is?
Well, I'll mess it up because I've studied, I've been in classes and taught with people, but it's a place of the joy of non-being, a place of tranquility. We're not talking about having angel wings and singing praises to anything, really. It's just in my understanding of it, it's a place of collective solitude. I think to call it a monastery wouldn't be right because that's just too Western, but an ocean in which you are.
So here's my question, right? Is, do you have consciousness in Nirvana? Because that, to me, has serious implications for it, right? Because I feel like in the Western conception of death, and as a matter of fact, the reason that a lot of afterlives are created in theologies is this fear of the oblivion. Like, people don't want to think that when they die, it's over, right?
Right.
So my thought, what I'm curious and want to know is, if Nirvana is oblivion, and if in Eastern cultures, in Hinduism, that's the goal, is to eventually die and have there be nothing instead of being reincarnated and continuing to go through the process of life. Because that would be like a completely diametrically opposed sort of view of oblivion,
It would, and I'm cheating, Joel. I'm looking up. There's a good mythological online encyclopedia that I just want to bring this up because I don't want to be misrepresenting, and oversimplifying is necessary in what we do.
Yeah.
No, I don't want the rock band. I forgot all about the rock band. Sorry. All right. I think that it's... You see, because the whole thing built into... It's not Hindu, it's Buddhist. The whole thing built into this is disattachment, enlightenment. Well, if you're enlightened, you're going to be aware. So, the escape from samsara. Samsara is... And this is Buddhist. I beg pardon. I said Hindu and I shouldn't have done that. Samsara is all the things that trip us up. In my yoga practice, we learn about this all the time. You get into a bad habit without even realizing you get into a bad habit, and it trips you up from your practice. And you realize, no, I shouldn't be doing this. and so you stop. As if it's that simple, but so you stop. And so nirvana is they're not going to be, you won't be reborn anymore. And there is an awareness because you see the world as it really is. You recognize the sum total of the entirety of what the universe. So in that sense, you are gaining all knowledge, the things that some humans, we try to find things out. We want to know. What are you going to know?
So that's interesting. So there is a consciousness, there's an awareness, there's an enlightenment,
but a disattachment, because knowing you can do anything about it.
Right. So and the goal is for everybody to end up there. So that's a non-binary one. Now, is in Greek mythology, does everybody end up in the underworld?
Yeah. That's and so in that sense, it's non-binary too. It's whatever the word is for 25 different levels and sections, And Dante wrote about all the circles of hell, which was a very medieval concept. So there's the bad, but then there's the worst, and then there's the absolute bad. So even in hell, there's a class system, right? But I think you could call that non-binary because everybody goes to the underworld. It's pretty much where you go. That's why in the Iliad and the Odyssey, if you get an opportunity to go down and visit the shades, as they're called, I mean, they're cold, they're gray, they're hungry, thirsty, but not really the way we would understand it because they can't. And some are in like Tartarus, Tantalus, and so on, and Sisyphus. They're in really difficult. I almost said Sisyphus was in a rocky situation. Okay, I'm wandering. But yes, in the broadest sense, it is. I mean, you're not going to go to Olympus unless you happen to be a demigod, the son of a god, and they really like you and they welcome you in. So but that's so minuscule in terms of the number of characters that I would say it's non-binary.
So, and when you start to look at the different situations people can find themselves in, or like the different levels or these sorts of things, what separates it from just regular life then, other than the everlasting nature of it? Is it just
because you can't feel anything, but you still are aware? It's not like we were just talking about Buddhism. It's not an awareness that is ultimate knowledge, omnicompetence. It's not that. It's you miss everything. It's not that you're getting flayed and burnt and shredded and all those kind of things. That it's that you're cold and you're wandering and you're a shade, you're a shadow, and you're a shadow. And that's not a very pleasant thing. Now, and this is traditions get mixed up with each other too. And some, there's a sort of there's an Elysian fields. Oh, well, maybe you're lucky and you get to go and live on a nice island, but mostly not. So how you live here is really the important thing. Yeah.
And I think that creates, it creates that difference between the kind of the Eastern and Western thought about it. What's important, I think regardless, people are going to look at it and say, okay, how you live is important. But I think for the Greeks or for the Western culture, you're thinking, well, how you live is important because this is your life. Like it's not getting any better after this. Whereas in the Eastern version, it's almost like the reason why you live is important is because it's a refining process. So you're trying to get to a higher state, which are two different conceptions of it. Yeah. All right. So is there anything else we should add about afterlives? Anything we haven't covered?
I'll only mention Epicurus. It was an ancient Greek philosopher, and of course was getting past the idea of the stories as stories, and it had that marvelous, seemingly simple, which it isn't, but to stop worrying about death. He would say, "You die 1,000 times before you," kind of thing. Every time you think about it, is that you you can't know what's going to happen next. You won't be aware of what's going to happen next. Epicurus is the first one on record in the Western world, apparently, to have said that. You're here, and then you're not. When you're not, you won't know you're not. So he wasn't buying into the shades and the underworld kind of stuff. He was buying into that ontological notion that, and the epistemology, that what can we know? We can't know this. Nobody can know this. We can tell ourselves this. We can convince ourselves this. We can say, yes, we know we're going to heaven or whatever. And I'm not making light of that again, but philosophically, no, you can't know that. You can hope. You can be curious. You can wonder. Well, here, then not.
So what would you say about, we have, and so I think that view could be seen as pretty, depending on the person, right? You can look at that as very scary or kind of relieving, right?
Yeah.
Oh, so when I die, it's done. Like, I don't have to worry about anything else. That it's over. Or you could look at it as, when I die, I'm done, and like there's nothing left. Like, so it's kind of the two different views you can use on it.
When I die, I don't know what happens next. And so why should I spend my time worrying about it?
Right. So what do we say about that versus Pascal's wager?
So on the off chance that there might be a heaven and a hell, live as if there really is one, even if there isn't, because then you're likely to go to heaven.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a moralism in that says, you ought to be good. But really, why would you need to be held over your head the possibility of punishment? It's this punitive thing that I find an enormous obstacle. Because it's so built into us. We want to punish people who do not believe what we believe. We want to punish people who do not live the way we choose to live. And it's not just about people hurting other people in ways that we think they should be put in prison. And this is across time and space. We want punishment. There's got to be punishment. Why? Well, any number of explanations. We have no power to stop somebody we think ought to be punished, but we know there's a bigger power than us, and they'll get him eventually. So there's sort of that schadenfreude of someday you're going to get yours. But I find that petty. It's not really justice. It's a hope for punishment, which I don't think is necessarily the same thing. And I think so many eschatological death focused systems do that.
Right. And so you could almost look at Pascal's wager. You can look at it in one way if you believe in an afterlife, and another way if you don't, right? Mm-hmm. And the curious thing about that is, if you believe in an afterlife, there's really almost kind of a negative moral aspect to it, as opposed to if you don't. If you believe there's an afterlife, then the reason you're acting good is to save your own neck. Yeah. Whereas if you don't believe there's an afterlife, then you're acting good for the good of society, for the good of your fellow
Precisely. And these kind of conversations came up. I don't, when you were in class, I mean, I know that they always came up each semester in philosophy classes, where some students would out and out declare that if you didn't believe X, Y, or Z, then you were going to be punished. If you didn't believe that, there was no way that you could be a moral person. And that's utter nonsense. Morality is not dependent on having to believe that somebody or something is going to put you through all of this. If it comes from, I will do this because I think that the rightness of it is its own reward, well, then we're not altruistic if we're still looking for a reward. But if the rightness of it is right, then one should try.
Yeah, and that, there's different, that leads into different conceptualizations for reasons behind doing good things. You have egoism, which is, okay, I'm doing something good so that I feel good. And then there's collectivism, where I'm doing something good for the good of a group that I belong to. And then there's altruism, where I'm doing something good for somebody else, even though it's not good for me.
Yeah.
And that's an entirely other podcast on its own, talking about these sorts of things. But yeah, so I think, there we go. We covered some of the gods of death. We covered some of the conceptions of the afterlife. And we'll see if maybe next time we want to cover the soul, or maybe we want to move on to something else. But until next time, keep pondering.